Okay, greetings, citizens of Athens. In this video, I'm going to respond to some good questions that I've received over the last couple of days as people were preparing for session number 2, as well as some questions that came up in the session. But the kinds of questions that I have in mind here are questions about sources. So as people are trying to construct their arguments, knowing that they're supposed to be engaged with a background conversation and texts, what kinds of sources might they draw upon to support their position? This is something that I want to address, especially as I think that this is something that's important to discuss in general, beyond this game, just in terms of thinking about how to use sources in any kind of academic argumentative style writing. I also received a couple of questions about how exactly does my view or position or the thing I'm really interested in fit on the agenda and connect with what everybody else is talking about. And so, again, I think that this is interesting to discuss because it has broader significance beyond this game. So I'll say a bit about that. I've also talked to a number of people about thinking about the audience as you plan your speeches and deliver your arguments. This explicitly came up in one of the sessions. Somebody asked a speaker who exactly their audience was. And earlier in the semester, I might have put this in terms of who is your reader. So this is something, again, with general significance beyond this game that I want to talk about. And finally, another question that has come up in a couple of different forms is whether or not the arguments you're hearing in the assembly are actually going to convince anybody insofar as people have their own interests, objectives, and factional goals. So I want to think about this question from the perspective of the game specifically, because there is, I think, an answer to this within the game where you are committed to objectives. But I also want to push us to examine the wider significance of this question, the connection between what we see happening in the game and how that might relate to, real life. So that's the Q&A portion. I also am going to go through the actual arguments that we heard in the assembly, so that's the commentary part of the video. And like last time, we'll, for at least a good number of these arguments, put them into standard form, clearly identifying premises and conclusion, getting at how the arguments connect with one another and how you can go about critically evaluating them by putting them into standard form and trying to set them up as, whenever possible, as valid deductive arguments. Okay, so let's think about the question of sources. So the question I'm actually getting is, I need to argue for X. Is there anybody else arguing for X that I can draw upon? And for a number of the positions, the answer was roughly no, but I think that it's worth clarifying a few general ideas about the significance of using sources within the arguments, speeches, papers you're developing within the game, but also just anytime you're asked to write an academic paper or an argumentative paper. Probably a common way of thinking about the point of using sources in your writing is to support your claims. And sometimes it's clear that that is how we use sources, especially if you are making a claim where it matters that you get the facts right, maybe a statistic or something like that, and so you appeal to a reputable source that provides a statistic that supports your point, or something like that. So that's one kind of way of using sources. But what I want you to think about is the difference between the effective use of sources and fallacious appeals to authority. So sometimes sources are appropriate authorities for our claims. So if you are making a claim about a certain, like, say, gun-related statistics, appealing to some agency that has conducted reputable studies, that is a source of statistics, like, that makes sense. But if you were appealing to a source to support some interesting philosophical claim, a normative claim, a claim about how things should be or what would be good or something like that, and in fact, a lot of our claims, sources don't themselves provide evidence for our claims. So, for example, in one of the sections, Callias knowingly snuck a fallacious appeal to authority into his argument. It was starred in the speaking notes that he gave me, where he appealed to Cephalus's claim about wealth as support for his claim about wealth. And there's no reason for us to accept Cephalus's claim about wealth being better for justice and morality. And likewise, Socrates is not an authority. Maybe Socrates said reasonable things that are themselves good arguments that you can bring into your argument and critically argue yourself that these are good arguments. But the fact that Socrates said it is not itself a source of support. Although, recall the difference between logical argumentation and persuasion. If people generally think Socrates is an infallible source of wisdom, then merely name-dropping might be persuasive, but it doesn't provide good logical support for your claim. So instead of thinking of sources as support, like where you look to support your claims, instead, especially for a class like this, where we're not just trying to get facts about the world right, think about sources and your use of sources as you showing that you understand and are engaging with a background conversation. There is a topic on the table. Some people have provided, like there's a background conversation or a history of people who have engaged with this topic or question and who have presented arguments and ways of responding to this question. And your goal is to understand the lay of the land, the conversation, the arguments that have been presented, the various views people might have and how they've developed it, and then be able to enter that conversation. Now, that being said, this is where some of the people, like say in this game in particular, do have something to work with in terms of arguments or at least views, because we're reading texts that they are, say, because of their own positions within the game, that they can draw upon. That doesn't mean by appealing to Socrates they thereby have supported their claim, but they at least have a general framework for developing an argument, and not every position is like that. And so the answer essentially was that for many of your views, you had to develop your own arguments without seeing how other people have argued for them in order to, use their arguments and say, and these are good arguments. And generally people have done a good job with that. But if your question is just, well, how should I be engaging with sources so that I can show that I understand and engage with a background conversation? Well, maybe there isn't a source that has made a kind of argument that is directly relevant to your view, but there certainly are sources that are in the conversation. Perhaps you disagree with them. So being able to show that you understand, so just because the Socratics all are well aligned with the views and arguments of Socrates, doesn't mean that any non-follower of Socrates doesn't have to pay attention to these views, because you should be able to argue against them, and the best way to argue against such views is to understand what exactly they are. And they're kind of radical, so I hope that in the next couple of sessions people really take seriously some of these views and get into them. Okay, so just, it might be worth noting that in the context of this game, beyond what I've said, you might also think of sources as providing you with the historical context, because as we'll see when we go through the arguments again, sometimes things are a matter of principle and we're arguing from principles, but also what's actually happening. What are the consequences of certain actions? What is life like in Athens right now? How much money do we have? How many people are there? What is the economic reality? So knowing about the historical situation is relevant to the arguments you're making. So of course you can draw upon sources to support your understanding of what are the facts on the ground that we're dealing with as we are making arguments about how we should structure this city. So there's that too. But I definitely want to flag that when you think of engaging with sources, it's not I need a quote or I need a piece of support. It's I need to demonstrate that I understand a general conversation. I know what the arguments are and I'm engaging with and responding to them. I know where I fit into a conversation. Speaking of fitting into a conversation, let's talk about strategies for doing that. So in the context of playing the game, we have an agenda, but the agenda is essentially a guiding question. And one thing I want to suggest is that in discussing how different people, so you've got roll sheets that have given you views, and some of the views don't seem like direct answers to the guiding question for the day. So the guiding question for session 2 was, should worthy medics and slaves be allowed to vote in the assembly and in the law courts? And some of you are supposed to be arguing things that are not a direct answer to that question. And so the question is how do you connect with the broader conversation and the guiding question, and what are some strategies for figuring that out? But alternatively, you could think of this as the reverse of when you are given an essay prompt or a guiding question or a question for debate, and you're supposed to write a paper. You don't always have to directly answer the question, especially if that question is very, very broad and it's your task to narrow it, to come up with a claim and argue for it that is on the topic raised, but you've identified a narrower scope within that broad topic. This advice is relevant to that as well. So the major sort of thing to think about, again, is this idea that you're supposed to be entering a conversation where the question is difficult or interesting. There's more than one way to think about it, and no way is totally obvious. There are many reasonable perspectives one could take on answering the question, and so whatever question you have and you're thinking of ways of answering it, you want to start trying to think about what would this conversation look like? Who would be in it? And then consider ways of reframing whatever question you're given to work with. In some cases, broaden it, in some cases, narrow it, and let's look at the question on the table as an example of how to go about doing this. So our original question we're given is, should worthy slaves, medics be allowed to vote? Step number 1 is to find ways of clarifying this question. Are there any words that can be interpreted in more than one way? I think the most obvious word is, what do you mean by worthy? There are also historical facts that are important here, like who exactly are the slaves? What is the situation here? Does it fit with what we might be thinking of when we use the word? What is a medic? So there's historical stuff, but worthy is the one where, like, that could mean a number of things. And when you say be allowed to vote, a thing that might be worth clarifying here in the debate, and this will come up again when we look at the arguments, is citizenship versus voting rights. Like, what exactly is the difference? Does every citizen get to vote, or could there be more citizens and only select citizens have voting rights? These are technically different categories. Another thing you can do is reframe the question, especially if you're given something that seems to have only two positions, a yes-no question. Technically, this isn't really a yes-no question, and there is more than two positions, but essentially, like, yeah, if we don't get into, well, what do you mean by worthy? essentially it's should they or shouldn't they, yes or no. And you could either broaden or focus the question as a way to reframe it. So if you don't think that worthy slaves and medics should be allowed to vote in the Pnyx or whatever, one way to broaden it is to, instead of directly engaging that question, back up and say, who should be allowed to participate in governing the city and why? Before we even get to the question of worthy slaves and medics, who should be allowed to participate? Maybe this isn't a road you even want to go down because you have an answer to this broader question that immediately cuts off this option or something like that. So by broadening it, you can figure out what the bigger conversation in which we've ended up talking about this more specific question and where you stand in that bigger conversation. You could also focus more. So for example, you might say, assume that worthy slaves and medics should be allowed to vote in the Pnyx. We've got plenty of reasons on the table for thinking we should be leaning this way, but the real question on the table is, what should the criteria be? What do we mean by worthy? And you could focus a whole argument narrowing in on that. Now, how broad or focused to get depends on the context and the status of the views in question. So if everybody is on the same, like the arguments in favor of broadening citizenship, that's what everybody agrees with. The weight of arguments is on the side of broadening citizenship, and the question people are really divided about is how to figure out the criteria for participation in government, what worthy means or something like that. Then maybe it makes sense to go more focused if that's the conversation that everybody is engaged in. But if by doing that you are failing to engage the views of other people who are relevant to the conversation you're having, that might be too narrow. So there's not always a clear, like, what level you should be arguing at when it comes to writing essays. So thinking beyond this game, usually you should use, am I going to meaningfully engage with things we've been learning in the class, things we've been reading and thinking about? If that's something that seems relevant, that's usually a thing that should guide the level at what you are focusing on, how much space you have, and what you personally have to say. As you get further and further along in a subject matter, you tend to get more and more focused. So long as there is an interesting conversation, there is an interesting question, and more than one way to answer it, that's usually all it takes to have a good topic and a good paper. But it depends. And so figuring out what it depends on is part of your job as a writer. Okay, so let's say that you understand the background conversation and you understand where exactly your views fit into this background conversation. You have a sense of how you can logically argue for your views and how you can contrast them with other views and argue against other views, how you should qualify. Like you have a sense of the conversation and how you're going to fit yourself into it. This is where the question of audience becomes really important when it comes to how do you best deliver that speech or construct that argument. So it's important to ask, who is your audience? Who are you speaking to? And what are your goals? So maybe you are intentionally preaching to the choir. That's probably not usually the audience you have in mind, but maybe in some cases it makes sense that you think of your audience as like-minded people who are likely to agree with what you are arguing. You might also be trying to reach people who actively disagree with you, or you might be trying to reach people who never thought about this question and don't realize there's something interesting there, who haven't formed a view, and you are trying to convince them to see things in an interesting way that is your way. And which audience you have in mind also relates to the goals that you have in mind. So if you're preaching to the choir, one reason you might be doing that is because you're trying to rally them to do something. Or you might be trying to, if you're reaching out to whether it's people who disagree or people who don't already have views, you might be trying to convince. Sometimes we're just trying to inform. Usually, the essence of an argumentative paper is that you're trying to convince somebody of something, either to do something or just to believe something, or believe that something implies something else, or that something is true or the best good. But in some sense, there is convincing at the heart of an argumentative paper. What about the audience and goals of academic essays generally, especially where you're supposed to make some kind of argument, which is most academic essays? Who's the audience? What are the goals? Now, one natural answer might be the audience is your instructor and the goals are get an A or something like that. But having that particular conception of your audience and goals in mind isn't necessarily going to help you produce the quality work that will get you the A. So thinking about them in terms of what a good paper is probably more helpful. So how do you think about the audience? And for this class, I've often suggested that you think of your reader as somebody who doesn't already know this topic but who would be interested in it. So you have to inform them as well as show them there's an interesting question here and show them different ways, like the background conversation for thinking about this question, but then enter that conversation and develop your own view and convince them that this is a good way to answer the question. And in doing that, your goals are usually like inform and convince, but you demonstrate that you understand the question, the space of possible answers, the background conversation that's engaging with this question. You can critically evaluate the arguments that are in that conversation. You can figure out where you fit in, develop your own point of view, support your claims. Like, these are the real goals of academic essays. And so usually writing to an audience who doesn't know about this can help you to really spell everything out to make your position more convincing. And the goal is, the nice thing about this Athens game is that you know exactly who your audience is. You know exactly the things that they believe and what their goals are. Your goals are to actually pass certain policies and change the style of government that we have. Where in academic essays, you're not directly engaging with other people. Like, you're not going to deliver it and have people raise questions and debate you on the spot. But you are engaging with, whether it's a history of people, you are engaging with people. And so attending to how people might respond to you can really help you to think through the arguments you're developing. And your goal, usually with academic essays, is to get at the truth, whatever it is. You could even have your goal is to convince yourself. Figure out what you should believe. An argument doesn't have to have two people disagreeing. An argument is supporting claims with reasons. And you might do that for yourself, for the intellectual pursuit of truth. So keep that in mind. Okay, so this brings us to the question of whether or not we can actually convince people, especially in the context of the game, people committed to their faction objectives. And I think yes. So if just in terms of gameplay, the answer is yes. So there's unless the rest of the class just isn't trying, there's no faction who should be able to achieve every single one of their goals perfectly. There are going to be trade-offs that have to be made, and so there is room here. Now, what will be the cause of making trade-offs? Is it to achieve the most goals possible, or is it to achieve the best city possible on the basis of arguments we're hearing? So ideally, when people are thinking about their objectives, it is a game and there are objectives, and it's fun to pursue your objectives even you're supposed to pursue them even if you personally, as a modern person, don't agree with those objectives. But really try to imagine a person who would wholeheartedly accept these things and who does want to build a new government. Like, what trade-offs would they be willing to make on the basis of the kinds of arguments you're hearing. It's a complicated headspace to be in. I get that. And so I guess there is some question, like what would be the source of making a trade-off? Is it really the force of argument, or is it just managing faction goals and maximizing what you can achieve? Now, there are lots of indeterminates in the game, especially in the 530 section, and these people can really swing the vote one way or another. And there are characters in the game, both in factions and not otherwise, who are not driven by principles, by convictions. And so as an example of that, there are people who are driven by sort of the end result, like power or fame or something like that, who are interested in kind of pursuing their individual objectives and aren't super committed, even if they're in factions. Like, they're committed to their factional goals unless they have an opportunity to acquire power, fame, or whatever. There's actually quite a few characters who would be interested in this if it's an option. So these people, again, are you going to be convincing them with the force of argument? Unfortunately, remember the bullshit versus logical argumentation distinction is that they're not tied to the truth. They're not pursuing the truth. They're pursuing some other thing. And so the truth doesn't really matter to that thing. And that sucks in real life. So speaking of real life, how does this kind of situation in the game fit with real life? Of course, there's an interesting analogy here. It's not a perfect analogy, so we don't have clear, explicit factional goals, and we don't necessarily think of our commitments as winning. Like, you don't win the game of life by getting everybody to do what you want, or do you? Should we think about things in terms of winning rather than pursuing the truth? Again, we're really getting at the something that might be related to the bullshit article that we read. But this is an interesting thing to continue to think about. Continue to think about your experience playing this game and how we consider arguments and do our best to figure out what is true and how things ought to be by engaging in public deliberation and argumentation. This is an excellent kind of reflection question, so keep thinking about it. Okay, I'm going to end the video here. So what we've covered so far is just general questions that I've received as people have been trying to develop their Session 2 speeches, and I wanted to make a video because thinking about these questions is relevant to all of the academic essay and argumentative writing that you'll do, as well as some interesting questions about the nature and value of engaging in logical argumentation, which is a philosophical question that we raised at the very beginning of our class. In the next video, I will focus specifically on the arguments we actually heard in Assembly Session 2, and I will put some of them into standard form and point out places where you can critique various arguments and try to get at how they all fit together.